My thanks to the Chicago Bar Association and the Dublin Solicitors Bar Association for this invitation to address you on what will not appear to be a legal topic until the very last minute of my talk. I am not going to comment at all on all these presentations of Dublin Crystal, although I suppose it's pretty hard to get Waterford Crystal these days. This being an Irish event, as soon as I walked into the room, I was greeted by Peter McAvoy, who grew up across the street from me in Waterford, Ireland, who I've not seen for over 40 years. So I don't know if he stuck around for the speech, but I was happy to see him this morning in any event. I'm going to talk to you for about half an hour on Waterford Crystal and its history, at least that part of its history that led me to write a book about my father, and I am indeed the author of Maestro of Crystal, which is a biography of my father, the late chief designer of the Waterford Company. He died at 86. It was always a shock to customers of the Waterford product throughout the United States that the designer of the iconic Lismore pattern was still alive in Waterford and wasn't some historical figure from the 18th century. I'd love to have my dad here. He's had to endure a number of my speeches, always maintained some kind of a vestige of interest in what I was saying. Wherever he is, I hope he agrees that this is a fair presentation of the facts about Waterford Crystal, and I'll give you a more serene photograph taken in the summer of 2004. Something great happened in Waterford, Ireland in 1947 that changed the history of Irish industry and brought the name of Waterford across the world. What was achieved in 1947? If you cast your minds back, those of you who may remember that era, there's nobody here who does, I'm sure, the only Irish international brand name of the time was Guinness. And 40 years on, in November 2000, a US market research company did a survey of US consumers, which demonstrated that Waterford had the highest quality ranking among all of 19 important brands in the US market, including Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Bose Audio, Toyota, and National Geographic. And the signature pattern of Lismore came on the market in October 1952. The world's best-selling crystal since the crystal pattern since the 1960s. 25%, ladies and gentlemen, of the company's sales at the time the Waterford Crystal went out of business was accounted for by that one product, Lismore design. 25,000 brides register each year, and did always register each year in the United States to have Lismore as their preferred pattern. My father and his mentor, Charles Batchick, came to Ireland and developed a niche product for Ireland, special to Ireland. They could have continued their continental tradition. They chose instead to look to the old traditions of Ireland, the patterns which were established in the 18th and 19th centuries in the old Waterford Crystal. My father went to the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin and made freehand copies, detailed freehand copies of 20 designs that he found there. And then he went back to Waterford, and he and Mr. Batchick chose to move away from their own tradition and their own training in Czechoslovakia, and the old Irish factories as well. That tradition was to cover up every single part of the crystal. The surface of the glass was always covered with detailed, very tiny wedge cuts, very close cutting, tiny cuts which did not admit the light. In order to avoid that kind of design pattern, that kind of density, it would be necessary to create a very high quality gleaming crystal so that you could leave some part of the glass blank. And eventually, Waterford was able to provide and produce that kind of high quality crystal at the new factory and move beyond the original Irish designs, the cluttered designs of the 18th century that inspired them. But it was not just that they were inventing a new way of looking at the old crystal from the 18th century. Remember when this was the mid-20th century, the era of modernism and functionalism and simplicity and utilitarianism. The Scandinavians dominated the crystal market in the mid-20th century, and they had a cult of undecorated plain glass. So in that era, it was an interesting choice and a difficult compromise on the part of Waterford Crystal to match the modern taste for simplicity with the luxury and refinement of the old crystal. And I think my father got it right in Lismore. In 1952, in his greatest burst of creative energy, he developed the great sweets of Waterford. What you see here is Sheila. Notice the resonant Irish names of this crystal. Here is Curramore. Here's Hibernia. And here again is Lismore. A rich variety of items was created for each of these sweets. The Continentals did not have this multiplicity of components in their crystal. They used single glasses for general purposes, for red and white and water and so forth. But the sweets created by Waterford Crystal were mathematically precise, scaled versions of each other. So you had, for example, separate stem glasses for port and sherry and white and red wine. You had low-stemmed liqueur glasses, round-bottom glasses for whiskey, goblets, sherbets, claret glasses, continental and saucer champagnes, hocks for dry and white wine, highball cocktail glasses, brandy balloons, cordial glasses, and even, as my father said, for the person to drink, tumblers from 4 ounces to 14 ounces. The Continentals never came up with that. That was a Waterford idea, and the sweets took off like topsy in the United States, and people started to collect them, and the company grew and grew in the United States through that tremendous idea of creating the sweets. Now, of course, these days we're back to one glass. My father called it the big lovely bowl filled with wine. In those days, there wasn't much wine that could be put into a Waterford glass item like that. It had to be a small amount of wine, and one has to say that the wine bottle has now migrated back to the table, destroying the need for the beautiful tapered decanter. Well, Waterford in the Havel years, I would have to say, drove the glass of fashion, drove fashion rather than was driven by it, and we have to ask, what happened to that confidence? Many of the things that my father wanted to achieve as an artist and as an industrial designer with his eye on commercial production, including scaling back the heaviness and the intricacy of 18th century crystal, maximizing the advantage of the glitter and sparkle of 33% lead crystal, the heaviest in the world, and the delicate decoration matching the form of the glass he achieved in the Lismore product. Look at the lower half of the glass drinking bowl, right here. Look at that lower half and focus on it and see the large but well-spaced diamond cuts, the wedge cuts, which were much larger than those that existed in the 18th century, paired with a series of up and down perpendicular cuts, very light, into the glass, which do not disturb the lovely conical shape of the glass, but rather flow in harmony with it. Shape was so important to my father's sense of design. He created the shape first, and then he put the cuts to suit the shape. And finally, look at the top of the glass. Look here at the top of the glass, the blank space, the negative space of clear, highly polished Waterford crystal. That's how we appreciate the Lismore product. And one of the attributes of mouth-blown, as opposed to pressed glass, I would say, which my father credited to the Waterford crystal brewers, was that they could manipulate molten glass to produce crystal that was relatively thin on top and thicker to the bottom, so that, unlike the continental glasses, which were uniformly thick, so that the wedge cuts, the deeper, more characteristic wedge cuts, the diamond cuts, could appear strongly on the bottom of the glass, and then a graceful, undecorated surface would rise above the thinner upper area. The US reaction to Lismore was craziness. Bing Crosby led the way. Purchased the entire suite many times over. Thousands of products circulated around the United States. Lismore made its way into homes throughout the United States and was loved by millions. And all credit too to Con Dooley, the marketing genius behind Waterford Crystal, who persisted in the view that America was the market worth penetrating to reach out to the 40 million Irish Americans, the diaspora, who would enjoy this historical product from the old country. He was told that Americans, especially Californians, don't drink wine or use glasses. They sit on the beaches and they drink their coffee out of paper cups. He did not believe it, and he was right. In summary, my friends, if you ask me what was Miroslav Havel's genius in the development of Waterford Crystal, I would say that it was the invention of a design protocol to adapt the flamboyantly ornate and deeply interlaced cuts of 18th century Waterford crystal, laden with the mystique of Irish history, to the 20th century marketplace. Look, the revival in the use of heavy crystal in the mid-20th century was the result of Waterford crystal defying the trends of modernism and simplicity and utilitarianism and functionalism. It all began with Waterford crystal in Waterford, Ireland. I couldn't imagine a greater Irish success story, not even Ryanair. In the 1950s and 1960s, thanks to the happy conjunction of great design and clever marketing, Waterford responded to a boom in post-war American consumer society. Let us hope that boom returns. Ready to risk some indulgence, and led Ireland, Waterford Crystal led Ireland out of the era of shadows and table linens, ready to do this, a sophisticated appreciation of brand and product placement. When my father retired in the late 1980s, Waterford was the most successful company in Ireland and the largest crystal factory in the world. 3,430 employees in Waterford, 10% of the population of the city, with a great many more people dependent on Waterford, and much larger than its continental rivals, who maxed at 200 to 250 people in employment. Now you say, Havel and Batchick. Not exactly Irish names, but Waterford's strength in the early years was to tap into a powerhouse of skills brought to Ireland by people like my father and others from Czechoslovakia, Germany, Italy, and Austria, fleeing unemployment after the Second World War, ready to start anew in Ireland. Batchick was an example of it. Batchick was a bourgeois victim of the communists who had come to power by 1948 in Czechoslovakia. He left, like the von Trapp family, over the hills from Czechoslovakia into Switzerland, went to Ireland where he had some business connections, and thought he would start the factory in Carlow. He liked the sound of the name Carlow in the Midlands of Ireland because his first name was Carol and his factory in Czechoslovakia was the Karloff factory. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the story of Carlow Crystal. He blatantly misled my father, Miroslav Havel, to get him here. He needed my father's immense design and technical experience to start this factory. Batchick had the money, but he needed the talent. He needed the technical talent. So he told my father in letters that Ireland was a tropical paradise, full of bananas and oranges and tropical fruits that were in short supply in Eastern Europe. And he led this man across the continent of Europe in ruins. My father was in ruins and the continent was in ruins, telling him that there was a rich tradition of glassmaking in Waterford that had begun in the 18th century and was continuing to that day. The same misrepresentation that the Waterford Company itself would make years later to Americans, 200 years of unbroken tradition. Of course, it's not true. My father did research on this country he'd never heard of, era, in a Czech encyclopedia, and he found indeed that it was largely a tropical country. And he arrived in Ireland, a remote and unfamiliar place, after that horrible trip, wearing three-quarter-length plaid-coloured +4 trousers, high bright yellow knee socks, gleaming black shoes with fancy buckles and bright silver buttons on the side, and a floppy plaid hat perched on his head. He was wearing the attire of the spa towns of Western Bohemia, and here he was in Waterford, a leprechaun come to life. To the amusement of the children in that town. It was a poor town. He set about looking for Mr. Dunbar, Mr. Goodbar, Mr. Batchick, actually. He found the 6'7" Mr. Batchick sitting in a small shed, a builder's shed, in a field in the townland of Ballytruckle, looking at plans for a small new glass factory which would be making beer glasses for the pub trade in Waterford. There was no glass factory. So my father said to Mr. Batchick as he entered the little shed, and they were very formal in dealing with each other because they had that relationship in Czechoslovakia, Mr. Batchick, how many people have you working for you here? And Mr. Batchick's response with a straight face and again with typical Czech formality, there's just you, Mr. Havel. And in fact, here are the two men. My father, by the way, was not that short. It's just that Mr. Batchick was that tall. And this is taken in about 1949, 2 years after their great adventure began. As I wrote in the book, in these fateful few moments, with Miroslav peering in through the window and Bacik sitting there inside the builder's shed in deep concentration, the future Waterford Crystal was truly born. My father did not go home again for 25 years for various reasons, including the takeover by the communists. But his mother did come to visit him in 1962. She was let out by the communist government. It was such an unusual event that it was the lead item on the RTE news the night that she arrived. My father had many highlights in his career. There he is in a more recent photograph. He was an expert in every aspect of crystal production, from designing the trademark of Waterford Crystal to designing the packing boxes. He was a great industrial designer. He reinvented the crystal chandelier. This is the chandelier in the Kennedy Center, 4,000 pieces commissioned by Jackie Kennedy in honor of her husband. It's built from airplane metal that was supplied by Aer Lingus. Here is the huge set of chandeliers in Westminster Abbey, commissioned by the Guinness family to celebrate the 900th anniversary of Westminster Abbey. My father scaled these chandeliers down to domestic size. You could buy them for your home. One of the most successful Waterford businesses was the home chandelier. And former managing director Noel Griffin once said, the little company that made beer glasses for the publicans in Waterford later put chandeliers in Westminster Abbey and in the Kennedy Centre. It's sports trophies. How do you think Waterford became so famous here? It was partly because they served the modern nobility. The Penroses in the 18th century served the Anglo-Irish nobility, and that's how they got their product out. Waterford gave these sports trophies to sports celebrities, to Hollywood celebrities, and politicians. Politicians, the entire US Senate was buying Waterford at one point. It's such a powerful product. He was an artistic designer, yes, or the mass market, but he also did some of the finest crystal sculptures of the 20th century. You know what this means? He was actually carving these pieces out of solid blocks of high-density crystal. He didn't use a chisel, he used spinning copper wheels. He was an expert in engraving and sculpting and designing. Here are the representational abstract forms he did. The Concorde for Air France, for example, done from actual blueprints and scale representation. Here's something he did for Pope John Paul II. I'll finish with a couple of American themes. Here he is with a well-known person from America, and here is another New York theme. Another New York theme, a model of the Statue of Liberty for the bicentennial of the statue in 1986. My father was invited to a presentation of that gift from the Irish people at the White House. He carried that gift from the Irish people in his hand luggage on Aer Lingus. That happening today. It's a beautiful piece. Nobody said anything about it. It looks like a bit of a weapon, actually. My story finishes with my father's retirement, just before his retirement, on the south lawn of the White House. You may see some familiar figures there. You've got President Reagan, you've got Garrett Fitzgerald, the former Taoiseach. I love this picture. My father is standing in a ramrod straight posture. He looks like he is greeting them rather than the other way around. And he said afterwards, I did not bend, I match him. I thought something profound might have occurred here between these men. My father received a compliment from President Reagan, and then Reagan said, Mr. Havel, I see, sorry, I didn't do it. I can't do a Czech accent for Mr. Reagan. Mr. Havel, I see that you're wearing the same hearing aid that I have. And that was the sum total of the conversation, except for one more thing. A simple question. By the way, Mr. Havel, said President Reagan, where are you from? Because he detected a trace of non-Irishness. And my father said, and this time I will do a Czech accent, I am from Ireland, Mr. President. Reagan smiled, not quite believing that a man named Miroslav Havel, who sounded like that, could possibly be from Ireland. The local writer, Jim Nolan in Waterford, did a great radio series called The Glass. He said, it was a wonderful day for Waterford when Miroslav Havel and Charles Bacik came over the bridge in 1947. Sean Daly of Dingle Crystal, one of my father's protégés, said that my father wanted to stay true to the handcrafted tradition and was always sad to see technology come to aid the production of Waterford Crystal. He wanted a small, exclusive boutique. He always envied the Steuben glass company in New York, in Corning, New York. He never expected that Waterford Crystal would mushroom into this huge, multifaceted company in the 1960s, which produced everything from delicate thimble-sized liqueur glasses to mammoth stateroom chandeliers. That's not the company they imagined in Ballytruckle. They wanted a small factory making exquisite pieces, maybe 200 employees, but the money wasn't there. They had to create the larger factory to make the employment and to keep the production going. Steuben can do it. Why? Because it's backed up by, of course, Pyrex which is the big product that the Corning Glass Company sells. In any event, my father was never in any personal doubt that all the production design work at Waterford was an intrinsically artistic experience. He had the capacity over 4 decades to create a design ethos that resolved the paradox between the genuine handmade product and the mass marketplace. In training all those generations of craftsmen and craftswomen, a world brand name emerged and a new tradition, building on an old tradition in Ireland. It was an incredible achievement in industrial history. Mass production and high art were meshed and matched through Waterford Crystal. And Con Dooley used to say that Waterford Crystal would always be distinctive because it was made as though Miroslav Havel himself were shoveling the silica and the sand and the other ingredients into the furnaces and then making the fine vertical cuts on the Lismore goblet. It was economically unsustainable, but some technical advancement had to come. What if Waterford had stayed true to those traditions? There's an American phrase, great American phrase, to stick to your knitting. Stick to the things you know how to do. What if Waterford had done that? Would it have passed away in Ireland in 2009? As the Irish government gathers today, some of you may know this, for the much-hyped Global Irish Economic Forum, will tomorrow's session on promoting Brand Ireland through our global cultural profile remind members of the government that the Waterford name and brand and cultural tradition has vanished from its home nation under their watch? That the second biggest tourist attraction, ladies and gentlemen, in Ireland, the Waterford Crystal Visitor Centre, has been reduced to a few corridors populated by mystified backpackers and has lost almost all of its visitor traffic this year, and the cruise ships bypass the city of Waterford because the glass furnaces have fallen silent and dark. I know how poorly Waterford Crystal was managed in the 1990s. I know how unsettled industrial relations, over-ambitious takeovers, and unfavorable exchange rates damaged the company's performance. But the name never lost its luster. And even at the end, it was worth something to a New York hedge fund, which bought the name and the intellectual property rights, including the iconic Lismore design. And let me say, my father, in the tradition of Anglo-Hiberno-American jurisprudence, was a work-for-hire employee. He never had any ownership rights in any of those designs, but the Continentals have a great concept called moral rights, and I'm here to defend my father's moral rights. I truly believe that the name of Waterford Crystal became part of the Irish cultural heritage of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And as lawyers, you knew there was going to be a legal element to this. As lawyers, we should recall that our government, the Irish government, has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expression. And under Article 11 of that treaty, we as members of civil society, and in particular this group as members of the high priesthood of civil society, have an obligation to remind our government, to hold our government to account for its responsibility set out in that treaty to preserve and protect all expressions of our national cultural heritage. As the preamble to the Convention states, cultural activities, goods and services, have both an economic and a cultural value because they convey identities, values and meanings, values like pride in craftsmanship, and must therefore not be treated solely as having commercial value. Maybe this means re-establishing the kind of boutique production line that Havel and Bacik once imagined. I don't know. All I know for sure is that a Czech Irishman, that man there, steered Waterford Crystal into the success that made its name the glass of fashion in the 20th century. And maybe someday some other crazy Czech with a mastery of crystal making will come across the new bridge in Waterford with the same know-how that brought Havel and Bacik to Waterford. I hope that the tradition is not lost. I hope that the loss of the Waterford tradition will not come to pass and will not have died with my father. Thank you for listening.